Thank you for coming, and congratulations for getting up early this morning and being here. You're troopers. So welcome to our Methodologies in Record Production Panel 2.0. We held the first one of these last year, and the very last question last year in the Q&A came from one of our panelists this year, Philip, and he suggested that what we really need to do is start thinking about ontologies. And so we took him very literally at that, and that gave birth to this year's methodology panel. So today we're going to be thinking about ontologies in record production, and particularly how we might think of, begin the work of thinking of an interdisciplinary ontology. So an amazing group of panelists, Shara, Paul, Philip, and we have a couple of virtual guests who participated as well. Andrew and Tom Porcello and Amy, they couldn't be here today, but they have been involved in the preparation, and they've given me some statements to read out to you, which I'll read out shortly. So we have an hour for the panelists to discuss, and then we want to move into a kind of extended dialogue with the audience and hopefully get your input on this ontology idea. The panel, including our virtual panelists, represents a very broad spectrum of research perspectives in record production. And as we began our preparations for today, we noticed that despite our obvious differences in approaches, we were identifying points of convergence. And as we kind of pulled those threads, we started making some maybe grandiose assumptions about record production research. And we started to wonder whether some of these assertions we were making were fairly outrageous. But as we continued to talk, we decided we didn't care if they were outrageous. We were holding to them, and they wound up framing our preparatory discussions for today. So we'd like to present a couple of those, four of those to you today. These sort of outrageous assertions, which we hope will provide a certain amount of framing for today's discussions. So here are four of our outrageous assumptions. First, the process of production is categorically different than other music or sound making practices, and each of the panelists will elaborate on why they think it's different and how shortly. Our second assumption, production processes are how things get made in a context where consumption is always present. So we're not studying just any creative process, although obviously there are connections between production and other creative processes, but this idea of consumption definitely frames our thinking and our work. Third assumption, the essential nature of the production process is multifaceted. Producers do not ever look at things one way or operate on a single level. So record production research, therefore, must be inherently interdisciplinary. This in order to capture that essence, and it must integrate different perspectives to avoid reducing the production process in unrealistic and ridiculous ways. I think some of the papers yesterday touched on this. Elliot Bates's presentation, for example, he seemed to agree with this view that we can't describe production, say, only in terms of objects or only in terms of mediation, but that we need a kind of blending or some sort of amalgamation of these different perspectives to really capture the essence of what production is about. And we want to go further with this and argue that one fundamental perspective is that we have to incorporate is practical experience. We find as we go through, every time we meet at a conference like this, one thing that binds us all together, regardless of our research perspectives, is that we all seem to have a certain amount of practical experience producing in the studio and working with producers in one role or another, if not as a producer. And this practical experience, this practical expertise seems to always guide our research, again, regardless of the particular methodologies we're using. And our fourth outrageous assumption, lastly, following these following on this issue of the applied perspective, record production research cannot ever be wholly objectivist. That meaning-making and interpretation are integral parts of record production research, because the process of production itself, in practice, practitioners, our subjects, they're constantly engaging in their own kind of ontological positioning, right? Their approach to production. So in this regard, our producing subjects, the people, the professionals, the practitioners that we're studying are not essentially different from us as researchers. So these are four of the points of convergence that we identified, and four that definitely framed some of our thinking as we move forward to today. So what I'd like to start out the panel by doing is turning to our panelists, and I'm going to ask them first to identify your field, if you like, or not. Tell us a little bit about your either research approach or where you want to put a stake in the ground. And then, from that perspective, define record production research. What does it mean to you? Philip, would you like to start?
Yes, I will. Well, of course, they're really, really big topics, big assertions, and also that's a really big question.
You like to start small here.
Yes. So I will put my stake in the ground, which I have done through most of my publications over the last couple of decades. The critical thing that really interests me is the creative process, or creativity. I think there's a distinction to be made there. And when I use that word, I use it in the same way as the other people like myself who are researching. I've just come back from a conference in Oregon where it was just literally called a creativity conference, and a lot of the major players in that area were there. And one person I've been working with their model for quite some time. So when I use the word creativity, I mean bringing novel things into being that are valued in at least one social setting. That's become the standard definition in my research area. So I'll just repeat it again. Bringing novel things into being that are valued in at least one social setting. And I think you can study the world in a grain of sand, who I think is great. My grain of sand happens to be how do records come into being. So that's really what interests me. So there's my stake on the ground. That's the thing that I'm interested in. And to say what field do I belong to, my degrees are all in communication. So that's a real, to use an Australianism, that's a real bastard discipline. Why? Because we're drawing on the behaviourist areas of psychology, we're drawing on various areas of sociology and literary studies and all sorts of things. So my discipline is inherently interdisciplinary. And then as soon as you move into record production, you've got exactly the same process in place. I bring a different body of knowledge to maybe what Paul does, maybe what Charlotte does, and what you would do to this process. And that body of knowledge comes out of my musicianship. It comes out of my songwriting process as well. But also out of engineering, and then move out of those things into producing and bringing all of those things into that process with me. So my stake in the ground is kind of a number of stakes, but I would focus it right at creativity.
I'll start with the disciplinary part of it. My background is that I was, my undergraduate degree was in music, and I was a composer, and spent several years as a composer after I was working both in the film industry and kind of legit concert hall kind of classical music. And I went back to school to do a master's in composition, which I thought I was going to do. And the school I was at had just set up a 24-track studio, and it was the first one in town kind of thing. And I thought everybody ought to be right there in that place. And I discovered the composers were not; they were in other parts of the building. And and that was kind of my point of departure at that point when I did graduate work. Is I said, okay, I'm not going to do music. I'm going to actually go into this thing in a deeper way, and I gravitated to communication studies and media studies because that was the place where I could talk about things that I wanted to talk about and investigate things. So I moved sort of from a very narrow musical, kind of conventional musicology kind of training into a very interdisciplinary field that I discovered that included sociology and cultural studies in Canada was kind of very new and influencing communication studies in many So my background is kind of, I guess, maybe somewhat similar to yours, of moving from a fairly narrow training into something which was inherently interdisciplinary. In terms of defining, what production is, I think it seems to me, and this is my tack on things, is it asks the historical question first. Where does it come from? And it seems to me that, if we think about music making for millennia, it's always been a temporally and spatially bounded practice. Sound events can be made and shaped and projected and received in real spaces and real time, but they also disappeared in the making. So what sound recording first brought to music, or sound in general, was literally making records of those events. And that seems to be in itself a kind of interesting proposition, because it sets up a fundamental set of relationships. There's a performer or a sound maker of some kind, and immediately they need the assistance of some technician or engineer. They didn't have those designations yet to actually operate the apparatus to capture. And it was an apparatus, peeling away the layers of wax as the recording was made. It was a technical process, a very hands-on technical process that had to come into play. So managing the apparatus, and then at the other end of the spectrum, once those limitations of the medium were dealt with, the users also attended to the apparatus. So in playback, listeners were also kind of very aware of the medium as an object, as a set of rituals that they were. So it seems to me that set of relationships of musicians adapting their practices to the sound recording process, engineers manipulating and facilitating the process, and then listeners engaging with it as well, is part of a kind of collaborative and multifaceted process that continues today, whether we're talking about editing techniques and multi-tracking and digital come along. But in some ways, all of these things elaborate and make more complex that set of relationships. So for me, defining production is the kind of the overall coordination of those different categories of tasks and relationships that have to be employed to achieve the recorded object.
So let's start myself.
Yeah, of course.
Well, just going from what Phil said, to me, what I've researched in is creativity as well and production, but also like to find out, analyse how it is turned into art and to appreciate it as art. That's what I'm trying to argue. There's so more question why am I doing this. But my background, it's quite tragic really, because I did want to, ideally end up on the production side of things, but ended up doing research. But it's been a long journey, because like you, the team here, all my degrees on music, I started learning music, playing piano, things like that. When I went to college, further education college, I actually did a BTEC in music tech and popular music. And after that, I wanted to do a YTS scheme in production. But bearing in mind, it was 1990s, my careers advisor kind of laughed it off and said, no shit, I'm doing that. So I've kind of lived with that ever since. However, while I was doing BTEC, I did manage to get some experience. At a local studio, Ongar, now, I think at Farm Studios in Ongar, so I managed to get some experience there. And then around that time, the popular music degree was pretty low, it wasn't, popular then. So I managed to get on a degree programme, not so far from here, at the popular music degree in Sheffield. And I was kind of dabbling in performance competition, so I really wanted to be more of a performer, composition, experimental music. So I got into that, dabbled with music tech as well, and after I graduated, I went back home, worked at my local music venue for a year, had my own club night, also did press promotion, stage, lights management, and they had a recording studio as well at the Square, and my mentor there was a producer called Anne Chapman. who does hip hop and whatnot, collapsed lung, and but then I decided to take the safe route and go back to education, and with Ant and I went our separate way, and I opened his own studio in North London, and I came back here, Huddersfield Uni, to do my teaching degree in music, and I taught A-level music tech, and then I just started to do high school teaching for a couple of years, but at the same time I was still dabbling in the industry. I was doing press and promotions back in London as well, but with my teaching I was based in East Midlands, and still managed to get some sound work at the Charlotte local venue there. But at the same time, I was kind of drifting away from the production side. This might sound a bit weird, but at the time, the partner I was with at the time, he was a producer as well, so we were sharing equipment, he had his own independent studio, and then I got fed up high school teaching, and luckily I won a scholarship to do my PhD at Salford, which is great because it's hot on production, but for some reason when I went into Salford, from my experience, I did not manage to have hands-on there, so it kind of just fell. And then I broke up with my boyfriend, I didn't get back my equipment, I got my S20 back 5 years ago, that kind of thing, So yeah, it just dropped like that. So I just focused on trying to find other ways on how to appreciate record production from another angle, which I'm sure we'll talk about anyway. So that's my long journey, how I got here. So I kind of went the other way around, yeah. So ideally, in my situation now, I like to look at the art side of record production, and hopefully tell consumers or critics, why you should appreciate this. Yeah.
So is it fair to say that your approach focuses then on how do we get audiences to engage, or what's the nature of that audience engagement, and what does it mean to appreciate these recordings as artwork?
Yeah.
Can I just add something to that as well? I got a question at the end of a presentation yesterday from Laurie Burners, who was really interested in critique and analysis. And so her question literally was very similar: where do I fit into this in particular model that I'm dealing with? And we've touched on it a couple of times. The notion of the audience, or the question of perception, is ever present in a production process. I don't think you can ever divorce yourself from that. And Laurie's question was, well, okay, we're talking about record production here, we're talking about engineers, musicians, and so on. But where do I fit? And I think that question of being ever present is a pretty important one.
I think, again, in our pre-discussions, I think it was Paul's comment about consumption, right? And we all kind of gravitated towards that, and I think you're echoing that now as well, right? And also your own experience in communication, right? It presumes that there's a sender and a receiver, and to understand the communication system, we need to understand both parts, right?
Can I ask another question?
Of course.
Can I ask the same question of you that you just asked of us?
Yes, yes, but there's more. To have continuity from last year, as I said, we reached out to Amy Blyer-Crothers and Tom Porcello, and Andrew, unfortunately, couldn't be here with us today, although he tried, to give their definitions of record production research. And so I'd like to throw that in the mix, just because we're not broad enough already, and then I promise to answer your question. So Amy had a good excuse for not being here. She just had a new baby. So with a new baby on her lap and a toddler running around, she emailed me this, and I'm going to attempt to read this to you, in case it's not obvious up there. So Amy's comes from a classical music perspective, and she says, a classical recording session is, or can be, many different things, but when the particularities of an orchestral or chamber or solo session are stripped away, at the heart, recording classical music is a collaborative act of transforming or translating a live performance into a recorded object that can be listened to repeatedly in a variety of contexts. That translation involves the performer's usual musical utterances being, what is that word?
Put through.
What is it?
Put through.
Put through, thank you. Put through the invisible prism of the recording process. The work of intermediators, of the production team, and emerging as something new, an independent art form. Images of caterpillars to butterflies, or sliced through the looking glass come to mind.
Alice.
Sorry?
Alice was different than us.
Yeah.
Alice through the looking glass, thank you. I think you should read it. The collaboration that is necessary between performers and producers and sound engineers is usually hidden. Those stories aren't told. Those edits aren't explained. Remixes are not provided. Power dynamics, decision-making processes are not made explicit or discussed. Record production is dark art, thank you. Is a dark art, looking at these working practices and relationships and consisting either side of the translation through the looking glass, the translation, is an important way to get to that heart of what classical music production is, to question that and to discover what else it could become. Sort of. Thank you for my assistance there. Andrew provided type text. And Andrew tells us, record production, for me, record production represents all the choices and interactions that happen in the studio or recording environment that lead to the creation of the record. Interactions can lead to inspiration. The smallest germ of an idea can lead to a hook that is then held in the highest importance by the end listener. Those interactions between the various participants in the process, the technology, and the space absolutely fascinate me being Andrew, with the various choices made through the process at the center of that is Andrew's, fascination. Historically, knowledge has been passed from master to apprentice, often resulting in an engineer undertaking a process because it feels like the right thing to do, or simply because it has worked before and will work again. As someone who has approached record production not through the traditional apprenticeship, but instead through a more academic study approach, those important choices have become the focus of my work. What actually happened in that moment? How was that interpersonal interaction managed? How did the properties of that tool afford that particular emotional response? Record production, for me, is a study of all these elements, bringing together technique, inspiration, technical analysis, and measurement, and raw chance in the creation of the music that we all love to listen to. One where between the idea and the reception by the end listener, sits the producers of records. We are the translators of musical ideas into something that is taken on by a wider audience. So many of the processes and techniques are known. The study of record production provides the understanding to move beyond knowing the process and instead to understand those important moments, keeping the knowledge alive and feeling new inspiration and innovation through study. So already, we're hearing echoes from what the panel has already said, again, coming from different perspectives. Adding Tom's version of this. Perhaps this is a ridiculously simple or obvious reason to think about why it is important to distinguish production from other moments of music making. but I remain amazed that when people say, so-and-so has an amazing voice, or so-and-so has an amazing sound, and I ask them, well, have you thought about how they are recorded and what role recording plays in creating that amazing sound? That the overwhelming response is, huh? As if voices and instruments and sounds that emerge through headphones and speakers are unmediated, both in moments of production and playback. This seems so obvious to me, but so foreign to most music consumers. So drilling down to the differences between the music and the performance and the recording and the listening remain essential, in my view, for any attempt to theorize or describe music. Secondarily, to study record production is to study process, and therefore to study becoming. If ontology is a study of being, an important corollary would be understanding processes of coming into being, and the moment at which being is considered to have been achieved. What makes a good tape? What makes the final mix? And who has to agree on what basis? Thirdly, to me, an admittedly oversimplified schema of performing, creating, and recording music might look like this. There is playing or otherwise creating music for the self. In my old-fashioned world, that would mean that I noodle, or I practice, or I rehearse, or I play along. In any event, the room or the studio or the apartment or the house is empty. The music lives and stays within these walls. The only years present are mine, and the only temporality is now. Alternatively, there is playing for the known other, and this often means the other is present, often physically, but if known and not physically present, then the present at least is in mind. In this case, the audience is known and considered. There is a self-consciousness that comes from an awareness of what one knows of the other, an accommodation or rejection of what one knows of their taste, desires, and judgment. The playing, the noodling, the rehearsing is guided by a dialogue between the self and this known other. Thus, there is at least two sets of ears present in the performance. And lastly, there's playing for the unknown other, an other that must be, by definition, imagined. This audience is considered and perhaps still carries a self-consciousness attendant to the known other. But at very least, one must guess more, perhaps project or find some kind of focus to stand in for the unknown. And most often, I think studio recording fits into this last category, playing for the unknown other. One may wish to play for the known others, one's fans, let's say, but economic imperatives, if not mere desire for exposure, demand for broader audiences. Music and the sonic dimensions of music must therefore be crafted in relationship to the conventions that come to define unknown, imagined, and desired audiences. To study recording might be thought of as to study processes in guessing, perhaps educated guessing, but guessing nonetheless. So Tom, for those of you who haven't heard him speak before, comes from an anthropological background and a linguistics background, and yet again we see kind of very similar leanings, definitely echoing themes that all of you have mentioned. Andrew deals a lot with the technological interface, as you do yourself. Actually, at least two of you do yourselves. Again, Andrew's perspective also sort of wondered, well, what are we deciding around this use of technology? Themes definitely coming up here over again, and I guess to jump in and answer your question, where do I fit in? So, I guess background, I started out in a very applied, practical situation. Music school, degrees in composition, music production, and engineering, about 10 years of working as an engineer and producer in Boston, and then having a great idea to go to graduate school. And I think what propelled me into graduate school was why. The more I worked, the more I said, that was an amazing decision. Why the hell did they do that? And I had to know. So I decided to study music perception and cognition. And I guess I kind of stay in that area, perception and cognition area, and approach record production from that view. But of course, that is also a vaster field, right? Cognition is inherently interdisciplinary, has very, very close ties to communication. I think I maybe think of information in a slightly different way. And I'm interested in the process of actually perceiving that information, how we go from a physical sensation into a mental representation, the nature of that mental representation. But then again, also tying very closely to how do we make an appraisal? What are we attending to that informs that particular appraisal? So I guess my definition that I would like to throw in definitely follows on Tom Porcello's ideas, but I think also what else has been said here. I like to think of record production ultimately maybe as a kind of world making, recorded worlds, or as recorded technology advances, we're going to be having fully simulated or virtualized worlds. But I think it will still be record production in many ways. And these are worlds in which listeners come and they perceive in this world and they make sense of it, very much in ways similar to, though not exactly the same, as we make sense of our auditory world as we move around this world. So there are acoustic spaces that they may or may not resemble the kinds of acoustic spaces we walk around in the natural world. And what's interesting to me about producers is that producers are really important for deciding what is perceptually salient in these worlds, right? How are they what's gonna grab our attention as we, the audience, kind of experience these virtual worlds? And what is that information going to signal to the best that we can guess, as Tom would say? What is it going to signal to them? What kind of meaning? What are they going to infer from that? And I say, I'm trying to use the word visitors to this world. We're visitors to recorded worlds because the producer can never forget we don't live in them. You know, when we listen to virtualized acoustic space, it's not this world. There are similarities. We take ears that are adapted by evolution to listening here, and then we apply those capacities to making sense of a recording. And there are similarities in those processes, but fascinating. And what's really fascinating is that it's not exactly the same. We can listen to completely surreal recordings by Danger Mouse and make sense of them. And if we walk around the streets of Huddersfield, there's very little in the streets of Huddersfield that should prepare us for that experience, and yet we are prepared. So world making, we put it there. Can I turn back to the panel and say, some of you have already touched on this idea of what distinguishes it from other forms of music making, but anything else we should throw out, any other ideas we should throw out about what makes production special?
Can I say a quick comment?
Yeah.
Just on the things that have already been said, my brain is working ping, things are happening there. I'm hearing, this is the interdisciplinary thing, in your description, a parallel with sociologists called the question of artworks.
Yeah, of course.
And how that collaborative process is writ large. And the second thing is, I had the word in my head, decision making. We are constantly making decisions. And in some ways, those decisions are kind of focused at the record producer. Whether that's a hierarchy that we've just formed over a number of years of record production, and obviously another matter. Rob Tolson yesterday was talking about comparing agile methods inside design to the record production process, and the question of sprints. You go through a very intensive creative process, and then you're outside the studio again, and other things happen. Then you're back in with the team, and so on. So I think there are parallels there as well. And then the other comment up here about something that feels right.
Yeah.
That's a classic thing inside a process of record productions. That feels good, let's keep that. In fact, my major way of making decisions is watching the hairs on my arms. If they stand up, that's the take. If it's not technically correct or it's not musically correct, but it feels good, that's what I'm going with. And that question is literally focused back at decisions here. That's, to me, is not an entirely intuitive process. Right? It's like a different understanding of intuitive. Once again, I'm drawing on sociology there to go, well, that's a question of habitus more than anything else. And I went straight to Aristotle as soon as the question I think was on being, his metaphysics. It's like, I've drawn that a fair bit, but there's a constant interplay between antecedent conditions and things that can be formed, and the agency that someone brings to that, and out of that comes something new. In other words, you're not divorced from what precedes you. You're never working inside a vacuum, which then gets us to questions of the unknown other. In some ways, he was a record producer focused at being the representative of the known other and the unknown other. In some ways, that's your task as a record producer, is to bring that world into the recording studio and let everyone else in the team concentrate on their thing. And you, in some ways, are amalgamating those decisions. That's what's triggered for me.
Can I just add one thing to this idea of decision making and maybe pulling from sociology back to cognition for a second, is that I'm really super interested in, and I think one of the things that separates production from other types of music making is the way production demands of the producer an integration of knowledge and information that does not make those same demands on other types of musical contributors, right? Just the diversity of information that a producer has to integrate and weigh and balance. And so I think that production decisions are categorically different than other types of music making or even artistic decision making.
What did I notice that last night, because I only first saw Amy's comments last night, coming from a classical background, is how diverse production practices and how we define what production is in different genres of music. Classical music seems to me still the most kind of removed from the recording process. I mean, I grew up at a time when, as a composer, I thought electronics and sound recording were just integral to what I did, and I couldn't understand how you could be a musician in the 20th century without having some kind of knowledge of amplification and those processes. So the people in classical music, one of the only people in classical music that I can even understand is someone like Glenn Gould, who completely gave himself over to the recording medium and said, I'm going to integrate this into my practice. My performance practice is going to be influenced by what I can do in the studio. And he started to conceive of music in a compositional kind of way. He put together, he assembled performances. And that's kind of rare in classical music even to this day. Most classical performers really take no interest in what's going on in the studio, which is quite bizarre to me. But in return, the importance of production becomes even greater because those responsibilities for decision making and assembling performances actually falls to the engineers and producers in a very different kind of way than when they have to collaborate and negotiate with performers who are savvy to what's going on and want something out of it. So, in our attempts to define production, it seems we have to situate it in more nuanced ways, in terms of how it relates to a musical process, and I can see them as integrated. That's why even the listener part is a big part of that. I don't think of myself as being a producer and someone else is my listener. I'm first and foremost a listener like everybody else. I can absorb every kind of music that I can absorb and always have. And those experiences I feel I share with someone. And when we're engaged in making a decision process, I'm also engaged in listening like a novice. This is the first time I've heard this. How do I deal with this? And then how do I make a decision about it? So, I don't position it. I think it's cognitive in a way, but it's, I think of it as my new study practice in terms of psychology. There's kind of something about the senses, and something about how we psychologically process sound and make sound. From the time you're an infant, you need something, you cry out, because your voice travels across the world. You learn very quickly that you can summon people to your needs by crying out. So we were aware psychologically from a very, very kind of basic kind of way that making sounds and listening to sounds are very connected in a way that vision isn't. It seems like this. It takes a long time to kind of cognitively come to terms with an outside and an inside and perception visually. It's something about the listening process is so fundamental to the sound making process that I can't disentangle.
Every year I have a student who tries to create a mix, usually like a music mix or something, with a blood-curdling scream sample kind of buried in the mix. And, you know, inevitably when they play it in class, we all hear it. It's like, oh, but it's really quiet in the mix, and we have to have a discussion on why this is just never going to work. Like especially 5.1 mix, you know, the blood-curdling scream, really quiet back here. It's sort of you can't override that nature.
That raises an interesting point, because in the discussions earlier, you were talking about questions in neuroscience, that we tend to, in some ways, just want to focus on one particular aspect of that whole process and see whether that's the cause and that affects everything else. I think out of the discussions that we were having before, I think that even questions of cognition are related to contexts, and contexts, of course, have deep influence on cognition, which for me is the heart of the decision-making process.
Which actually is in my notes here buried, is one of sort of, I think, my requirements for an ontology, is that I need some way to talk about context. And that's incredibly hard to do, even if I'm writing a cognition paper, much less if I'm trying to do something even more disciplinary. But a way to, I need the concepts and I need the vocabulary, which will allow me to both capture how a producer understands the concept of the context and begin to understand the producer's process of adaptation to a specific context. That's definitely one thing in my ontology wish list. But Shara, I wanted to, before we go too far from this thread, I wanted to check in about how you think maybe production is different from other forms of music making.
Yes.
Why can't you be a regular musicologist?
That's what I'm like. So just going on from what you said, what Bill said, decision making, control comes into my mind, and producers, you can tell me later in the discussion, I try and think what's happening in the producer's mind and how to make it into a piece of artwork, because they're going to oversee everything, all their talent and energy is going into that. And so I do think control is the key. And personally, of course, producers should step in later. This could go a couple of ways. Obviously, they carry the musical ideas, they compose, they experiment with sounds, manipulate it, turn it into art, or they may be presented with music. So, please do some magic with this kind of thing, and they will. Or like it's already addressed, they may collaborate with other musicians and whatnot, and then make it as teamwork, and perhaps they will rely on the producer to enhance it more. In terms of what makes producers different from other positions like engineers, songwriters, performers, musicians. I think, it's the role. I think those who decide not to go into production or become a producer fully, they decide, right, I just want to focus on songwriting, I just want to specialise in engineering and whatnot. And of course, at the end of the day, they may be instructed by the producer, do this with this project, so what you can do. So I think it's like, it relates to the positioning of the person involved and the role involved as well. But at the end of the day, producers should step in, they have the say at the end of the day. And of course, they could instruct people, so play this louder, add more reverb, add more cowbell, what have you. But if it's just solely on the producer, they're going to do everything themselves. I think what, outside the box, what people need to understand is art is time consuming, and it can take a while to produce something, as we all know.
Can I ask, do you distinguish between or think about differences between, say, control and intention, or how are those concepts related or not for you?
Attention.
Intention, like as an artistic intention. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, the Boston thing is coming.
That's something I'm trying to figure out. Because when I first started researching into producers, I'm thinking, do they know they did that? That sound? And then going along over the years, I think they know what we're doing, really. So I think there is intention there, and that's why they had that control on what they wanted to produce. I think, anyway.
So I guess touching back on maybe what both of you said too is that there are behaviors, right, drawing from psychology. It's not just what we think we're doing. We're also acting and reacting in certain ways in the production context.
Well, that's it's interesting for that, because I was thinking immediately when you talk about control, the funny dialectic about that is that the degree to which you can control what's going on in the creative process actually frees you up and frees performance up to do things and take risks. It's like risks in a no-risk environment. So people can do stuff and push themselves further and kind of reach some kind of level that's kind of out of control. But it's in a context where you can correct and manipulate and things. So there's a kind of funny way in which the focus on control kind of actually has to kind of it opens up something else as well.
And that in many ways relates to the question about intention. Well, there's a lot of things there. How much of this is behaviorism, how much of this is a deterministic process, and how much control or choice or decision making do you have in the process, and what's the relationship between those two things? And for me, to take this back to the sociological level, because I think it's also applied in psychology, is that structure agency, dialogue that's going on all the time. How much do we give ourselves over to the process, and how much do we kind of steer the process? I think record producers in many ways are drawing a fine line between those two things. And I'm not even sure that control is the right word. I think there's a constraining set of factors, there's an enabling set of factors. So I think that control actually enables things just as readily as it kind of squashes things down as well. And I think you're quite right also about the question of risk and no risk environment. Part of the producer's role is to enable that situation to actually occur. And in some ways you're orchestrating that whole process. You're allowing people to make mistakes, you're allowing people to recognise things that they might not have recognised before, and so on. So I think there's a whole series of things to be teased out in the questions of control and intention.
And the producer has to mitigate risk as well. Yeah, so it's both sides of the coin. And as you're saying, the kind of constraints and almost the degrees of freedom, I think that connects back to what you're saying about these different roles. Right? That we're delegating tasks, and how does each contributor understand the degrees of freedom available to them?
Just as a quick side issue, I have a postgrad who works with Anthony Giddens' work on structuration, and the constraining enabling process is really important to him. So I set him a task, I said, you come up with a word that puts constraining and enabling together, and you've got the problem solved. So he came back to me with a very ugly word. He said, I'm going to use constrainably from now on. So you've heard it first here.
I love that. All right, before we make this even more complex, I think let's just, I've been furiously taking notes here, so why don't we just highlight a few of the concepts that I think have come to the fore that hopefully we would ideally like to incorporate in some sort of transdisciplinary ontology. First of all, we have the social aspect, right? We need to, music making, production is a social activity in all sorts of ways. Philip, you also mentioned really early on this idea of creativity, of creating something novel. And I think that there could be a lot of arguments about where is the novelty always in production, or is it always present? But at least sometimes there's that space. The idea of a compositional process, that record production as a compositional process. There's a historical notion. We need ways to talk about history, that the process of production is a continuum. Collaboration, I guess, relates to the social component. There's all sorts of adaptive behaviors happening. Audiences listening, appraising, consumption, art. We need vocabulary in order to address these artifacts as artistic artifacts. Decision making. I think probably several people introduced the idea that production is not a purely intuitive process. So we need to be talking about reasoning in all its various forms, or analysis in various forms in the decision-making process. We talked about various integrative processes, integration of information, integration of musical parts of individuals' work, control, possibly versus intention, the positioning, right? The producers positioning themselves, and of course, maybe it goes without saying, right? We need terminologies, we need concepts that allow us to talk about engineering and technology, and several of you brought up issues related to business as well. That even if we don't dive deep into the business component, at least the producers thinking of this, risk mitigation be part of that job. What other concepts are we missing here? What else should we throw into the pot?
I think it's interesting when you're looking at record production, it's clear that there's no one way of studying it, and you read to measure, I'm doing neuroscience, psychology, sociology, it's great, and I think from my side, probably a more cultural side as well. I think it's really nice, and we should recognise outside the box, obviously, that there are many ways of appreciating record production like you do with music anyway. And I think, it's an area that is slowly growing. I think it's nice to exchange ideas as well and see other ways of looking into production side of things.
I guess also it builds on the context idea, right? That there is a cultural context, right? Various cultural contexts.
One thing that came through as part of your saying, I think, as well, Tom's started out saying how surprised he continues to be that people don't recognize what's going on in record production, and Amy's dark art kind of thing. It seems odd to me that 100 years on or more into sound recording, and then certainly all of my life, I can't conceive of music except through with records. I grew up with records. It's music and recording was music in some ways. I can't figure out how it is that we continue to have these problems where people can't even recognize that these things are constructed objects, that the musician, that there's that whole thing about the record industry focused on the artists to the point where all the other people are just disappearing. Just getting your name on the record is like the first kind of recognition that the production crew was there. But there's still a kind of way where, even in live performance, I seldom hear bands acknowledge the mixer. And we want to thank the front of house mixer out there, or the people mixing our headphone mixers for us. There's a kind of way in which being in front of your fans and doing this stuff has to kind of somehow suppress everything else around it. And it will, in film, watching credits roll by these days in film is just astonishing to me. Everyone from the cinematographer to the pizza delivery people are listed there. And there are hundreds of people who make those kinds of things. The music is much more intimate. There's a proliferating kind of group of producers and engineers and mix engineers and master engineers that come into play, but not the kind of magnitude that you see in film. How is it that we can't recognize the contributions of this handful of people that kind of come together and make these objects that we listen to? MP3 files are objects too. How is it that we can still not recognize the fact that this is a constructed, artistic object? It's a kind of continually astonishing thing. As a society, as listeners, we have to develop that capacity to recognize it.
One of our music programs this year, the studio music program, we had a vocalist start this year, a freshman. She sounds like auto-tuned. She's grown up listening to recordings that have been auto-tuned, and she learns she's learned to sing by mimicking that. It's kind of astonishing to listen to.
Drum machines made drummers really better in that precision kind of way. They learn to be precise.
To answer your question, I think, and I've written about this before, I think there's a social construct, a discursive framework, particularly in Western civilization, which kind of says that, and this is the whole artist process, is a great deal of romanticism in what we do. And then to relate that to business, it's much easier to sell a single artist and the genius here and so on than it is to sell a collaborative process, because our culture is not used to the idea, or wants to get used to the idea that these are this type of film, which is the exception thing. We don't really want to go, it's not that person who's special, it's all of us that are special. From my point of view, working inside a systems framework, I bump into this problem all the time, that you've got people who are focused in a discursive way on Bob Dylan, and it's Bob Dylan alone that brings all those works into being, and negating, of course, all of the other people that were responsible, those people who have been in various frameworks, that simply Bob Dylan could not be Bob Dylan without those things being in place. So until we get past that discursive process, we've got to still keep asking that question. Because we don't really want to destroy the mystique, as it were.
Do you think that, this is wild supposition, but why not? Does this have anything to do with the fact that when we reproduce audio, a virtual performance, it invades the real world in some way? And when we go see a film or we play a video game, we are still entering that world. We understand that it's behind the wall.
Well, that's certainly, the phenomenology of sound is quite different. You go to a film, you're always aware of the cutout. There is a frame. There's no frame for this, and the editing process. If you want to allow yourself to be aware of it, and filmmakers want you not to be aware of the process all the time. But when you shift from mid shots to close-ups, you immediately can register. You can recognize it if you choose to. We can't always tell what's going on in the sound recording because we disguise it so well. But I like to tell the students that one of the funny things that when these moments of recognition, what Tom's talking about, I hear every now and again in interviews people talk about having heard Aretha or somebody live, and suddenly she put the microphone aside and walked down the aisle or something and sang, and people heard her unmediated voice for the first time, and how struck they were by hearing just a voice, traversing space. And I kind of, continually, think and try to tell students that we are confronted with mediated voices all the time. I cannot even conceive of Aretha's voice without the microphone. Everything I know about that voice has come to me through loudspeakers. And so the mediation is just there. And then I think in the vast majority of voices that I've ever heard, they are basically mediated voices. I'm more familiar with the sound, the intimate sounds of somebody's singing voice because of the invention of that mediated process. So I can't even think of there's a body somewhere there. But the thing that I'm dealing with is the voice has influenced me through the loudspeaker, through headphones. So if we don't kind of recognize that as a base, then we're always going to miss them. And always going to continue to be surprised when we hear people.
So we need concepts to allow us to talk about the transparency of record production, and we need concepts for being able to address and talk about the mediation of record production.
And the phenomenology of that mediation, because it becomes part of our experience.
And for me, that goes straight to the question of ontology. That if we're always dealing with a mediated world, then it's going to be highly problematic to position ourselves as objective in many ways, because if you're dealing with mediation, then that's your contact with reality, that's what your contact with being. It's always through that mediated process, then you can't step around that and get straight to the object itself. And we'd like to, but we don't think we can. That's an ontology. question.
It is.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's actually,
Yeah, exactly. So let's go straight there, and maybe via the route of constructivist or objectivist,
Yes.
right? Oh, yes, please.
Something quickly. I think, and to add that to the mix, technology plays a big role as well. Because when you were talking about the landscape, it reminded me of the quote you said. It's something like pop music in the 21st century, something called technology, so that kind of struck.
That's one of those outrageous kind of things.
There were many
to
outrageous
say. Just said it.
So moving into the form of this ontology, right? As you brought up a moment ago, constructivist versus objectivist, right? You know, what is the basic form? Can we ever be objectivist?
if I was an objectivist, I would say yes. I don't think I am.
My opinion, which is correct.
Yes. I think we've got to recognise that, you know, if we stand inside a particular world that is highly mediated, as we've been discussing, then that's an ontological position. And I really don't think that I could take myself and place myself in another ontological position. However, I've been in a faculty of science and IT, so I've had to deal with this question quite a lot. But you know, from an objectivist position, there is no other possibility. And I think that's what ontologies are about. Your understanding of the what is real, your questions to be, things that we need to bury in the back of our head so we can get out of bed in the morning and not have to face a philosophical question. Is the ground there? And if I've got to place my foot in it, is it actually there or is it something else or whatever?
Wait, we don't have to do that?
No. Sorry to say. You'll never have to do that. But I think that's important to us, and I think, you know, once you kind of recognise where your ontological position is, then you just accept that, and it gives you a certain degree of security inside that as well. But you've got to recognise that not everybody will hold to that particular position. You know, that I can't understand how someone could even conceive of thinking in an objectivist way, but I've got to recognise and be tolerant of that as well at exactly the same time.
You know, for myself, you know, certainly there are methodologies I can apply on certain more perceptual aspects of what I do, which approach objectivism. You know, right? There are empirical studies that I can run, but the problem with that is that the more constrained they are, the less they mirror real-world application. And although I can figure out something like you know, discrepancy, or I can track my subjects. What are they attending to? Or can they detect a signal? Just noticeable differences, right? That tells me very little about its significance to the subjects. You know, what are they doing with that signal once it gets inside? And then I'm in this dark territory, right? Where I have to figure out clever ways to elicit from them how that signal informs.
Throw a wrench into this. One thing that's concerning to me right now is the continuing digitization of everything. In the way there's actually a very objectivist kind of impulse or intention behind a lot of that, or kind of way of working. You know, we're thinking about how these things affect us, how they affect other people, our identity is formulating music, all these things. And you know, they're not interested in those things, it seems. There are statistical ways to analyze music and you know, take genre classifications and we can analyze them and we can turn them into algorithms. And we can turn people's tastes into algorithms. And we can use the mastering process and we can analyze all the thousands of recordings in hip-hop and we can come to a mastering curve that can be applied to any record. So there's a kind of way in which there's a software mentality that's kind of entering into music in both the consumption side and production side that says, all these things can be analyzed, they can be rationalized, they can be predictable, and we can have very kind of instrumental kind of ways of using that data as a kind of datification of taste, a datification of recording processes for the purpose of creating more data. So there's an objectivist kind of impulse, it seems to me, behind all that wants to say, well, your subjectivity is your thing. We don't care. We can just but we can analyze it and we can make it predictable. And that's been part of the record industry for a long time, making record production predictable in some way. But it's kind of like ratcheted up now in this particular objectivist kind of statistical, quantitative, algorithmic approach.
The process of codifying, right, whether even if it's through neural nets, it doesn't matter, but ultimately it's a process of reducing to a set of rules, a set of predictable patterns, right? Unfortunately, or for me, the big problem with that is what we value most in our great producers is how they break the rules. I mean, what makes a Brian Eno, what makes a Danger Mouse, what makes a Phil Ramone, or whomever your favorite producer is how they break the rules. So a lot of computer scientists would come back and say, okay, so I'm going to add random seeds to my algorithm. But the problem is there's nothing random about Brian Eno. Occasionally there's something arbitrary, but that arbitrariness is still filtered through his experience, his ears, everything that causes him to be who he is right now.
That's an interesting point, because that question of application of something is literally premised on the question of determinism. And that's been a holy grail for Gordon. If only we could figure out why people like things, and we could just reproduce it for them, and be hitting his affair anymore. But I don't think human beings work like that. We certainly wouldn't have art if the whole process was completely deterministic, and you could reduce it to an algorithm of some sort. I think that process is getting closer and closer. Hopefully it ever hits the mark, because we're totally redundant, and we tell human race to go over here and do something else while machines took whatever they want to do, whatever. That's a whole other scenario. But I think what we're searching for as human beings is the gaps in those processes. We're looking for those things that do make our best thing at the end. And us as researchers are trying to get close to whatever that process might be. But I honestly, this is an ontological thing for me. I don't think we'll ever get there. Validation stands in our way. And I think there's a deep question there that you're asking about the question of choice for us, and what we bring to the process, which is the individualised thing, and what then the relationship between those two things and those deterministic processes. So I think that kind of strikes at the heart of, for me, that strikes at the heart of what we want to get at that thing, but it's not a question of mystified at all, but it's a question of to recognise that there is something special in there, and we can get to know it as closely as we possibly can. But God forbid if we do know it objectively.
And also to bring back to what both of you said about history and what we all said about context, right? What we like, what we respond to, what we consider to be art is changing. If I made a silk screen of a Campbell's soup can today, they would be like, yeah, who cares, right? It's not, we can't see it as art anymore. It's done its thing. So it's going to be something in motion.
Yeah. I'm going to take it straight back to your field.
Okay.
In cognitive psychology, there's a cognitive psychologist called Margaret Bowman, who's you may be aware of. Her concepts of P and H creativity, I think, are pretty important. But we've got this kind of demonstrates the relativity laws to me. That I can come up with a can of soup, and that's personally creative for me. But as soon as I take it out into the world, someone literally does that others been done before. It doesn't necessarily mean that my own creative process isn't as significant to myself as Andy was. And that, to me, introduces the gaps of relativity in the whole process. You can't objectively say that thing is creative, novel, and original forever and all time, because you've got these degrees of things going on there. You've got personal things happening where you might be developing a series of set of ideas that are novel to you. Take them out into the world, and then you're just another blues artist, 145 or whatever. But for me, these things are quite creative in the process. So that brings for me back to away from this idea that there is an absolute that we're striving for. It's always going to be reality in relation to our own individual understandings of what's going on.
So we're running out of time, so I want to make sure we leave time for audience ideas. Before we open up to the audience, any last ideas about our individual ontological positioning? Are there things we have to have in order to research the kinds of questions we're digging?
That's a great question. You've given us a chance to give us the last word on this.
No, because I'm going to open up to the audience. They'll tear it out apart. While you're digesting that, or thinking of that, I'm going to throw one into the mix here, which will maybe be a bit contentious. So, because I'm so interested in brains and perception, the brain is an amazing machine, and other things. And we certainly do have faculties and has functionality that appears to be very sound and music specific, but it's also great at redundancy or kind of riffing on a theme. But once the brain has a way of solving a problem or handling something, we tend to see it over and over again. So from my perspective, if we come up with ontologies or approaches or key concepts which isolate making sense of music production, which are not in some way applicable to other modes of production, other types of creativity, to vision, to filmmaking, to cooking and perfumery, then I'm in trouble, right? So my ontology, not the whole thing, but large portions of it need to be generalizable to other forms of sensory experience in the world. Otherwise, there's something not right about it for me.
Yeah, I would agree. And I just made a very brief reference earlier on to Blake, that you can see the universe in a grain of sand. I've still got that wrong. You can see the universe in a grain of sand, and I think what we're trying to do is to start with a very universal set of ideas that apply to this specific thing. But if that specific thing that you're looking at, the object of the research, isn't applicable in a generalisable sense, that's we avoid the so what question. What are we actually doing? What are we contributing to all of those spheres? So I think you're quite right. As much as if we don't have a way to extrapolate our findings out of our research into a more generalised world, then we're just stuck in the silo.
Yeah. Back to your point about algorithms, right? If we develop an algorithm that generates a new body per hour, that's cool, but it tells us a lot about doctorals, but it doesn't tell us about musical creativity.
No, it doesn't tell us much about
Anything else we should add to the wish list now before we add to the audience?
I think it's been very good.
So, thoughts, ontologies, your own ontological positioning, yeah?
You asked me to make some notes, so I'm going to filter down to one point, and I'd like to add it to your wild assumptions. The producer is in a new position to destroy art without being the artist.
Wow. Destructive potential, yeah.
You've all heard of records that went on.
Yeah.
And often comes taken not by the artists, not by the engineer. Decisions made by third-party producers. And I think that is a wild assumption. I think not the artist destroying the art. The artist is entitled to destroy their own art as much as possible.
Yeah.
But
and maybe your idea of third party is really key here, right? Because if that producer was truly socialized or part of the culture, sort of as somebody standing with those artists, potentially such things wouldn't happen.
well, in many occasions, working in studios, you knew all the producers in the room, and you knew them for all reasons. It's never. The producer's responsibility is to keep the band happy and reputable. Right, finding a balance.
Yeah.
And when that balance goes wrong in favour of the record label, sales, that's when the art's been destroyed. That's not the band. that they, for example, a band, there's not a band that they're not person, the record label saw live in a performance in a room with 200 square feet. That's not the same record. So that's destruction. I think the producers in this case are in a position to destroy art before it even gets critiqued.
Yeah. I think there's a question of failure there as well. We touched on it a little bit earlier. We tend to see all those things that succeed. We don't necessarily. Film is a good example. We don't see all the crap films, although there's quite a few actors who do so. I think that there's a question of letting those things go through. I think that situation you're describing is quite common, but it's the wrong decision making gone on prior in pre-production. Why did that person get selected? Why wasn't there someone more compatible with your scenario with the band? Why didn't they recognise that maybe this band was better off in terms of being recorded in a live situation rather than overdubbing and so on? Maybe
there also could be a personal dynamic. They may fall from the correct genre, but they may have a personal dynamic that makes the music go wrong. That's the process. Why does Mark Ronson find himself making the Queens of the Stone Age records and a funk record?
Yeah.
Why? Is he a good producer, or is he just a really nice guy you want in space? Is that a good or bad production decision?
Sorry.
But it's those kinds of disputes that lead artists to become self-produce or want to have production credits. That they want to negotiate that thing and not just be. The industry prefers a hierarchical structure that has somebody in charge. But from the artist's perspective, so they don't walk away with a record saying, that doesn't sound like us, kind of thing. A lot of people have kind of, once they become a certain power, a certain kind of clout, market clout, you can say, no, I want to co-produce or I want to produce.
Yeah, then you're looking at bands like REM, it's a cash cow, you don't make an REM record. You don't make anything else, you don't come out as an REM record. And it's a cash cow scenario, the bands are making the right records, they know what the decisions are. It's like, there's some great examples where probably fans have heard like the third album by their favourite band and it's great. The song's still in shape, but there's something about it that's raw. And then they look down the critics and look back and they go, this studio is involved somewhere and it's destroyed this album.
And in terms of ontology, sort of tying it back, right, that puts us in a position where we've spent an hour talking about how do we develop a set of concepts that allow us to talk about coming into being, but we also need to include a set of concepts that enable us to talk about impediments to that process in one form or another.
And for me, as a systems thinker, I think that it's a multifaceted process, and you have got to take into account personality. You don't understand how people work at a psychological level. I don't mean
No, I understand.
Yeah. You've got to have that set of factors in place as well as the understanding of what the mixing desk is doing at a technical level. Producers are in some ways pulling all of those things together. I don't think it's necessarily just about personality, it's all those things together. And that's, for me, that's the wonderful thing that happens in a recording studio when it is working is the synergistic effect of that. You get the right people, the right room, the right set of microphones, the right technology, the right level of financing, you get all those things in place, and art happens. Sometimes it doesn't.
Art was destroyed by not the artist, was my point.
Yeah.
That was the point of rest of it was kind of just fun.
The second album syndrome comes to mind.
Maybe the first album syndrome.
The producer ruined it,
Yeah.
And we had us like, so I said, you're right, But at the same time, it's all the people who's been brought in, who's been hired. Maybe, in some cases, industry makes some bad decisions.
Just thoughts really. It's been fascinating. Last year's fascinating too. We do this weekly. It's interesting how conversation tends to focus quite a lot on the traditional recording space, the traditional roles in record production, and obviously there's a key shift towards self-production or a band member producing. I thought what Tom picked up on about the in a dialogue that when someone's present and when one's self-producing, and the different negotiations and thoughts and processes that take place, and how, you know, in terms of researching and observing participants, when we have a traditional recording, so as a traditional plans, I use that in a general term, I think that's far more helpful, whereas before we thought it couldn't be done. I feel more comfortable now with the idea that it can be done because roles are better defined than when it's, say, band members and there's relationships, there's formal relationships that come into play, whereas traditionally you might know the producing world, and you may build a relationship and you might see them every few years when you work on an album and it's the same producer, those types of relationships. But to capture ones in a dialogue and censorship and process that comes into the room, and insecurities and all the other layers that come into play. And also touching upon the Brian Eno production, where, for example, if you listen to some of his own work, compared to work he produced along with band members, and who working with Daniel Lanois, to be able, unless you're in the room, to be able to dissect when somebody may just made one comment that would have changed, and that's not even noted by the producers themselves, that somebody actually planted that seed, or somebody else took you in one direction or another. You know, it's well documented that Brian Eno actually is very cautious about going into the studio without somebody that's been technically minded. Or, you know, that's why he works so well with Daniel Lanois, because he found a perfect match, and, you know, they went into the U2 space, and you can imagine how many different chefs and lots of cooks were in the room. So I think in terms of objectivity, and in terms of the dialogue, and in terms of all those, that it's so multi-layered. So we can list some tools, and we can list some key core ingredients. But in my mind, it's very helpful to set the scene right, whether it's a traditional recording of somebody else's work, or whether you are invested in terms of being a composer or contributing composer to that process, or whether it's a self-producing project. Because when we have these discussions, those that have less experience, especially practitioner experiences, tend to maybe take away information that can only really be applied to one set of circumstances. And maybe that's a good thing, and perhaps try and apply it to another set of circumstances, because we put all of it under the umbrella of record production. And I think it would be really helpful for us to more definition on the role. I wish there was, you know, we talked about record producers and self-producing composers, was found a more helpful way of defining those two roles, because they are so different.
Actually, in my own work, I try to be, and maybe it's similar for you, but I try to be really clear about production expertise or production intelligence, because I would think that more than I would think, but even when I work with people who self-produce, right, it's almost like they're wearing different hats. And of course, it's not clear-cut, because the job makes it so easy to combine compositional processes with production processes, but there's ways of kind of distinguishing the kinds of decisions people are making, or perspective, ontological positioning that they're bringing towards certain decisions. I think you've touched really on what was the crux of our argument about constructivism, though, as well, because we can't know what's in their head. We can observe as best as possible. We can interview. We can take reports. But even anything they report to us is filtered through their own filters. And that's our data. That's what we have to use. And if we look at, say, the decision-making literature in general, we're studying emergency room procedures, whether a particular emergency room doctor is from, Canada or Nigeria, or recently got divorced, or just won the lottery, it is really not something we have to consider so much in their work in the emergency room. We can share a context with them as decision makers, understand what data is pertinent for them in their decision making. But a producer, whether Brian Eno saw a particularly nice color of blue on the way into the studio that day, it's really unknowable, and it leaves us in a position where we have to construct reasons.
I think one of the things that has always struck me about sound recording, and different than film and other industries, is that there is an industry structure that kind of is hierarchical and wants to see if there's a traditional way of recording. But the knowledge is so distributed within pop music, especially, where from the days of the Porta studios, where people engaged with the technology at home in a particular kind of way, just to learn it, and make it part of their practice, so that when they were confronted with a producer or an engineer who wanted to do something, they could say, no, that EQ isn't right. So there's a way in which what complicates production in popular music, especially, is that distributed nature of the knowledge. We're not always giving ourselves over to a group of experts and letting them make the decisions. We're actually engaged in it and kind of savvy to it. And that's an important part of it. And I think part of all the technological changes that come along is always that kind of process of getting to know it and distributing the knowledge as widely as possible. It's one of the reasons why the software companies, I think, are continually doing it. There's a kind of educational process that's going on. That happens outside of universities. It's a kind of hands-on kind of learning process that everybody has to go through, and it's one of the things that makes it healthier in some ways, so that doesn't happen. It happens often enough, and it happens partly for all the wrong reasons, because it's an industrial structure that's trying to make everything predictable and manageable and whatnot. But there is that kind of tension between who gets to claim that they're the artist and who gets to claim control over the situation. And it's not always good.
Any last final comments?
Just want to pick up on the generative AI computer science that we've seen there. It's coming. It's pervasive. It's already in our forms of distribution. It's there, right? So I was just wondering if you could comment, perhaps, on where you think the place of this community, or how we approach that sort of the place of this community, how we approach that topic, and the parallel that would be in photography and the power that we all carry in our pockets now, and what that has given to that field, and where you see, or where you see some potential in us to impart knowledge.
One thing, that's why generalizability is so important, for one thing, right? I mean, if I don't publish results that a computer scientist can turn into code, or I can sit down with an AI person and translate that into an algorithm, then I'm in trouble. Because they won't engage in research. So I think making sure that our research is packaged in a way that has clear inputs and outputs for other disciplines is essential. And I guess I would add to that, and something I've argued a little bit with some isotope people about, is consider the depth of knowledge about process in this room, in this conference, right? How well we understand producing and all the different processes that make it up. There are some very talented algorithm creators out there, but they haven't written PhDs on the process of producing. And so they may be amateur musicians. They may go home and muck around with Pro Tools at night, but that's not the same. And so I think the real danger is that you have somebody with a very superficial knowledge of what production is, who code algorithms that then get packaged up and sold to people who really do know what production is, and said, go make music with this. it makes choices for us that we don't want to make.
I think the onus is on us to some degree on that. I think I'm kind of confronted by my lack of knowledge of code. I have someone in our department who teaches electronic music, and everybody, he has to keep the computer science kids away from the course so the music students can take it, because they're interested. But we're not I've never been as interested in coding. I wrote a driver for a printer once when this didn't come all packaged to me. And I spent a whole day getting it to go from one font to another and being able to get it to tell the printer to do bold and that kind of stuff. And I hated it. I thought, this is just the most mundane thing, and if I get a comma wrong in the code, everything falls apart. And it's that kind of precision that I just couldn't stand. So I've kind of shied away from computer science and coding. But there's a kind of level where I'm now kind of thinking, I wish I knew more about the way those people think, and the way they work, and the way they do things, because now they're affecting everything I do. And so there's a kind of level of responsibility, I think, as academics, that we have to kind of learn a little bit, be more interdisciplinary than we are, or something, and actually confront science and confront IT and kind of say, okay, how do you think, how can I gain more knowledge so that I can get, so that thing in my pocket isn't just this opaque kind of thing. There are processes going on here that I don't have anything, I have no knowledge of, I have no understanding of it. That's always been the case in the analog world in some ways. I can't get inside of a piece of gear and really fix anything or do anything. But there's a kind of level of opaqueness here that seems to go beyond that. And I'm starting to think that everybody needs to actually kind of come to terms with coding in some ways. Kind of terms with the mindset and precision and all the things that go into creating algorithms so that we can intervene and we can get that same kind of level of distributed knowledge that I was talking about a minute ago. Everybody knows something about recording when they enter the studio. Nobody comes in as a complete novice. But with this stuff, I feel like
Actually, can I make an appeal to any full professors that might be in the room? Actually, they don't count, because I know they're going to agree with what you said. If you look for job calls, like job postings for in music cognition labs and even non-music oriented labs, perception labs, I was just in a meeting in an acoustics department, right, where they have a big data person or a machine learning person, right? And if you look at those calls, what they ask for is, somebody who's a computer scientist, somebody with, exceptional C++ or C# skills, right? Or knows this, somebody who knows neural networks. And then way down in the call, it would be good if they had knowledge of acoustics, right? It would be good if they had a music background, right? And what does that mean for our fields? Right? If that is secondary and it's a huge danger.
Just a comment on that. Just to step back a little bit, one of the things that I've had to do as an educator is come to grips with the automated visualization, everything that flows from that. Because jobs are changing, which is your question about automation. It's a $6 million question. What will the world look like as a result of all this process? And there's been quite a number of studies about the changes in occupations and so on. And I was discussing this with a colleague from my team only 2 or 3 days ago. And he said the very last thing that you want to be is a coder these days. Why? Because it's one of the things that is highly repeatable, and you can just put an algorithm in place and it'll be done for you. And the higher order skills seem to be the thing that we should be, or attempting to be, educating ourselves towards. And I think, and of course I would say this, that they are production skills. They are questions of creativity, they are questions of curiosity, and they are questions of critical thinking. Is this true? That's critical thinking. So unless we can come to grips with those, and they are not repeatable in some senses, and that gives us a space away from questions of automation and other. Unless we can replicate those things as well. I think it was touched on earlier. So there's a whole series of implications that we need to tease out in that whole process. So it's a $6 million question, and I hope we have the answer to it soon.
University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.